That gap was only 3 inches wide. Yet it stood between a widow and a Kansas winter. Late in November of 1885, Lenora Vale, a young widow living on a windswept claim near Bluestem Ridge, drove cedar pegs into the log walls of her cabin. Each peg was checked with the same small wooden spacer. 3 inches. No more. No less. The quilts she lifted onto those pegs were the finest her family owned. One had been stitched before her wedding. Another had crossed the prairie in a wagon years earlier. Mara watched from the table, with a rag doll resting in her lap. Tuck lay across the doorway, his nose pointed toward the cold prairie beyond it. The cabin contained more quilts than firewood now. Outside, the remaining woodpile looked painfully small. When Agnes Whitcomb, the woman who led the local ladies' aid circle, stepped through the door, she noticed both things at once. She stopped before removing her gloves. "What in heaven's name are you doing?" Lenora placed the spacer behind the quilt, trying to make 2 weeks of wood last until spring. Agnes stared at the narrow space between the fabric and the logs. "Quilts belong on beds," she said. "They are meant to cover people, not walls." Her eyes settled on the faded stitching of the wedding quilt. "You are ruining things your family spent years making." Lenora drove another peg into the timber. The hammer answered before she did. Agnes moved closer and lowered her voice. "Everyone knows how little fuel you have left. Winter has barely begun, and there is no one here to cut another pile." The meaning was clear. Her husband Caleb had passed away. Lenora was alone. Agnes suggested selling the claim while it still had value. A widower near Dodge City might also be willing to take a wife with a young daughter. Lenora tested the peg with her hand. "I am not looking for someone to keep me warm," she said. "I am trying to keep the warmth from leaving." Agnes glanced toward the woodpile again. 2 weeks of fuel did not sound like enough time to prove anything. The 2-week estimate was not a fearful guess. Lenora had counted every remaining log. 3 weeks earlier, Tuck had barked for hours after dark. The old dog rarely made noise without reason. By sunrise, wagon tracks cut through the frost behind the shed. Fresh ruts led away from the claim and disappeared into the prairie. Nearly half the woodpile was gone. No witness had seen the thieves. No neighbor would speak of it. Even so, Lenora had her suspicions. Around Bluestem Ridge, one name seemed to appear whenever desperate families sold land for less than it was worth: Silas Reddick. A land speculator with a patient smile and a habit of arriving just before people ran out of options. Over the past year, he had purchased several struggling claims at bargain prices. Now his attention had shifted toward the Vale property. The stolen logs had shortened Lenora's winter margin to 14 days. They had also turned the last wood Caleb ever cut into a weapon against his family. Caleb Vale had built most of that woodpile during the final weeks of summer. Early in the fall, he went down to the creek bottom to recover a cottonwood trunk before rising water carried it away. The bank was soft from rain. As Caleb worked the log free, the tree shifted against the slope and rolled. He never returned to the cabin. By November, the marks of his labor were everywhere. A repaired hinge on the shed, a handle fitted to the splitting maul, saw cuts on the logs the thieves had carried away. One thing remained untouched inside the house: the wedding quilt. Lenora held it across both arms while searching for the strongest pegs along the north wall. The cloth had faded where years of sunlight reached their bed. Mara watched her mother lift it. "Would Pa be angry that you're hanging it up?" Lenora's hand paused over the old stitching. Outside, wind pressed against the logs. "Your father hated wasting good wood," she said, "and he hated being cold even more." She raised the quilt into place. Of every wall in the cabin, the north side needed the greatest protection. Caleb's quilt would hang there. Of course, hanging family heirlooms on the wall and maintaining that strange 3-inch gap Agnes had mocked was not the act of a woman who had lost her senses. It was the result of an invaluable lesson in survival. It all started with a trip into town, just a few days after the night her firewood was stolen. That day, Lenora had ridden into town for flour, lamp oil, and a handful of nails she could barely afford. The general store was crowded with people talking about weather. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about the coming winter. Near the stove sat Ellen Svedberg, an elderly Swedish widow whose cabin stood beyond the creek. Most settlers knew who she was. Few spent much time listening to her. She had survived winters long before arriving in Kansas. She remembered snow deep enough to bury fences and winds that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. While customers argued over firewood prices, Ellen asked a different question. What steals the heat from a house? Several answers came immediately. Bad weather, a weak stove, thin walls. Ellen slowly shook her head. Then she pointed toward the door as a gust of cold air swept through the store. Wind, she said. The room grew quiet. Wind takes whatever it can touch. Something about the way she said it made Lenora stay where she was. The old woman wasn't talking about winter. She was talking about a problem. And for the first time since Caleb's death, Lenora heard the possibility of an answer. Elin never explained things the way a teacher might. She explained them the way a person survives long enough to learn them. 2 wooden chairs stood near the stove. The old woman draped a blanket directly across the first one. Then she hung another blanket several inches away from the second chair. 3 inches. The same distance Lenora would later remember. Touch them, Elin said. After a few minutes near the stove, the difference became noticeable. The blanket resting against the chair felt cooler. The one hanging away from it seemed different somehow. Ellen slipped her hand into the space behind the fabric. The blanket is not the important part. Her finger tapped the empty space. This is. She spoke about rabbit nests hidden beneath winter snow, about wool mittens trapping pockets of air, about heavy curtains hanging away from stone walls in Scandinavian homes. The lesson was surprisingly simple. Heat escaped whenever it found a path. Moving air carried warmth away. Still air slowed it down. People spend their lives trying to make more heat, Elin said. The smarter question is how to keep the heat they already have. Lenora thought about the cracks in her cabin walls, the drafts around the door, the north wall that always seemed colder than the rest. For the first time, she stopped seeing the cabin as a shelter. She began seeing it as a system. That evening, she walked through each room with a candle in one hand and a notebook in the other. The small flame revealed things she had stopped noticing. Near the door, it leaned sideways. Along one corner of the north wall, it flickered constantly. A thin draft slipped through cracks in the logs and wandered across the room. She pressed her palm against different sections of timber. Some felt merely cool. Others seemed to pull warmth away from her skin. Several observations went into the notebook. Outside temperature, wind direction, draft locations, wall conditions. By the time the candle burned low, a pattern had emerged. The cabin was not losing comfort because the stove was too small. Most of the heat never stayed inside long enough to matter. And among all 4 walls, the north side was by far the worst offender. Back at the cabin, the work took 2 full days to complete. Lenora did not just use quilts. She used every spare piece of fabric she could find. The small wooden spacer Elin had used in the store sat on the table beside her notebook, exactly 3 inches. Every peg, every rope loop, and every section of cloth was built around that distance. She had started with the north wall, where the winter winds struck first, using the heavy heirloom quilts Agnes had seen. But the other walls required compromise. The west wall received lighter blankets and old woven rugs. The south wall, which caught what little winter sunlight the prairie offered, used canvas pieces that could be pulled aside during the day. Nothing was placed at random. Every decision followed a purpose. Meanwhile, the door became a project of its own. Lenora packed strips of burlap with dry prairie grass and pressed them into gaps around the frame. A draft that once whistled through the cracks now struggled to find a way inside. Several feet behind the door, she hung a heavy canvas curtain from a simple wooden rail. Anyone entering the cabin would pass through 2 barriers instead of 1. An airlock. A small thing. Yet Elin insisted small things often decided whether a house stayed warm. Mara handed over pegs, collected dropped tools, and carefully marked measurements in the dirt whenever her mother asked. Tuck spent most of the time stretched across the doorway, rising only when someone approached the property. By the end of the second evening, the cabin looked strange. Fabric covered nearly every wall. A canvas curtain divided the entrance. Rows of cedar pegs lined the logs where bare timber had once been visible. To an outsider like Agnes, it might have appeared ridiculous. To Lenora, it looked different. For the first time since the firewood disappeared, the cabin seemed less like a place waiting for winter. It looked like a place preparing to meet it. 3 days after finishing the quilt system, Lenora allowed herself a small measure of optimism. The cabin felt different. Drafts were weaker. The stove burned more steadily. Even the room seemed quieter. Then, on a cold morning before sunrise, Mara noticed something her mother had missed. She was reaching for a wool scarf hanging near the north wall when her hand brushed against one corner of a quilt. The fabric felt wrong. Not frozen, not warm. Damp. "Mama," she called. "This part feels wet." Lenora crossed the room immediately. The rest of the quilt felt dry. Only one section was cold and slightly moist. She lifted the lower edge and held up her lantern. Tiny droplets clung to the back of the fabric. The logs behind it looked darker than the surrounding wood. A knot formed in her stomach. Water was never a small problem on the frontier. Moisture ruined food. Moisture ruined timber. Given enough time, it ruined houses. Most of that day was spent searching for an explanation. By afternoon, Elin Svedberg arrived. The old woman listened quietly, while Lenora described what she had found. Then she walked past the stove, past the table, past the entrance curtain. Her attention settled on the north wall. Elin gently pulled the quilt outward and studied the space behind it. A smile appeared. Not because the problem was serious, because the problem was familiar. "The quilt is fine," she said. Her finger traced the sagging section near the center. "The distance is not." Lenora looked closer. The heavy wool had slowly settled under its own weight. What began as a 3-inch gap now measured barely an inch in one spot. The fabric hung much closer to the logs than it should have. Elin reached into her basket and pulled out the small wooden spacer used during construction. At one end of the wall, the 3-inch block slipped perfectly into place. A few feet away, it stopped halfway. There was no room left. The explanation became obvious. The trapped pocket of still air had collapsed. Cold from the logs moved directly into the fabric. Warm air inside the cabin met that chilled surface. Tiny droplets formed where the two temperatures collided. Condensation. The quilt had not failed. The measurement had. Ellen tapped the spacer against her palm. "This house isn't staying warm because of the quilts," she said. Then she pointed toward the narrow gap hidden behind them. "It stays warm because of the air you're protecting." The next morning, the repairs began before sunrise. Lenora removed the sagging section of quilt and stretched it across the table. Every support point was checked again. Every measurement was checked again. 3 inches. The number appeared so often it began to feel less like a measurement and more like a rule. Outside, Elin cut small spacer blocks from dry cedar branches, while Mara followed behind with a piece of charcoal, marking each section that had already been inspected. Tuck watched from his usual place near the door, occasionally lifting his head whenever the wind rattled the cabin. By midday, the north wall looked different. Additional supports prevented the heavy wool from drifting inward. A narrow vent was open near the roofline. Elin also added a simple moisture guide along the inside wall, giving any future condensation a path to follow rather than a place to gather. That night brought another test. The north wind strengthened after sunset. Temperatures fell steadily. Instead of going straight to bed, Lenora sat at the table, listening to the wind. The temperature outside had dropped to 17 degrees. Inside, the cabin held at 46. She had only added wood to the stove once since sunset. Those numbers stayed in her mind long after the lantern burned low. Hours later, she walked the length of the north wall carrying an oil lamp. The quilts hung evenly. The air behind them remained dry. No cold spots, no moisture. Across the room, Mara slept soundly beneath a single blanket. For weeks, the child had moved closer to the stove each night without realizing it. This time she stayed where she had fallen asleep. The difference was small, yet it was impossible to ignore. When dawn arrived, the conclusion was simple. Gap held. Heat held. It was only one night. Winter had not delivered its verdict yet. Still, for the first time since Caleb's death, the cabin felt less like something she was defending, and more like something she understood. The first signs appeared where prairie news always traveled fastest. A freight hauler passing along the ridge noticed something unusual about the Vale cabin. Smoke still rose from the chimney, but not in the thick, constant stream most homes produced once winter settled in. A few days later, another neighbor remarked that Lenora no longer spent every afternoon hauling fallen branches or gathering scrap wood from the creek bottom. People began adding those observations together. Questions followed. Answers did not. By the end of the week, the story had reached the general store. From there, it spread to the church, then to the water well. Agnes Whitcomb made sure it continued moving. According to her version, Lenora had covered nearly every wall in the cabin with quilts. Some listeners laughed immediately. Others pictured the scene and shook their heads. A few wondered whether grief had finally caught up with the young widow. The details grew larger with every retelling. By one account, she had blocked every window. By another, she was living inside what looked like a fabric warehouse. Each version sounded stranger than the last, yet beneath the laughter sat something else. Curiosity. Winter was tightening its grip across Bluestem Ridge. Firewood prices were climbing. Several families were already watching their woodpiles shrink faster than expected. If Lenora truly had found a way to burn less fuel, people wanted to know how. If she had not, the prairie would expose the mistake soon enough. Meanwhile, Lenora remained focused, carefully checking for drafts and the narrow 3-inch gaps hidden behind the quilts. She had no idea half the settlement was waiting for her experiment to fail. As December settled across the prairie, the remaining woodpile began telling a story of its own. Every morning, Lenora stepped out into the biting frost, expecting to see her 14-day margin vanish. It didn't. The weather grew colder. Ice thickened on the window panes. Yet the pile of split logs shrank at a surprisingly slow pace. The stove still required tending, but it no longer devoured fuel with the desperate hunger of previous winters. Small signs of victory appeared inside the cabin, too. Mara stopped dragging her blanket to the stove before bed. Tuck no longer disappeared beneath the bedstead whenever the wind howled after dark. Neither the child nor the old dog knew anything about trapped air or thermal loss. They simply responded to the quiet comfort around them. By mid-December, the survival of the cabin was no longer a desperate hope. It was a proven fact. And with every passing night, the fear of the impending winter retreated just a little bit more. Silas Reddick arrived on a gray afternoon just before Christmas. His wagon stopped near the gate. He stepped down slowly, brushed dust from his coat, and studied the property the way a cattle buyer might inspect an animal before naming a price. Lenora already knew why he was there. Men like Silas rarely traveled without a purpose. After a few minutes of polite conversation, he finally mentioned the claim. The offer was low, far lower than the land was worth. Yet he presented it as generosity. Winter has a way of changing people's plans, he said. I've seen more than one widow discover that spring was farther away than she thought. Lenora listened without interrupting. The prairie wind moved through the dry grass between them. When Silas finished, she declined the offer, calmly, directly. Nothing in her voice suggested hesitation. For a moment, his eyes drifted past her shoulder toward the remaining woodpile. The stack was smaller than he expected. That seemed to reassure him. A faint smile appeared. Silas had built a career on patience. He understood shortages. He understood pressure. Most of all, he understood winter. At least he believed he did. The conversation ended soon after. As his wagon rolled away from the cabin, he never looked back at Lenora. His attention remained fixed on the shrinking pile of firewood. In his mind, the season would finish the negotiation for him. All he had to do was wait. By the final week of December, the prairie began sending warnings. The barometer at the general store dropped steadily. Old-timers who rarely agreed on anything suddenly agreed on one thing. A hard storm was coming. The north wind shifted first. Then it strengthened. Then it stayed. Lenora recognized the signs and went back to work. The entrance curtain was checked and tightened. The airlock was inspected from top to bottom. Fresh stuffing was packed into sections of the door gasket where the burlap had settled. Inside the cabin, Mara helped tie additional support cords to the heaviest quilts along the north wall. Neither of them wanted another section to sag and steal away the precious 3-inch gap. Even Tuck seemed uneasy. The old dog paced between the door and the window several times before finally settling down. Outside, the sky remained gray. The temperature kept falling. Far beyond Bluestem Ridge, the storm was gathering strength. Soon, every cabin in the settlement would face the same test. Nature was preparing to deliver its verdict. The storm arrived before dawn. Wind slammed into Bluestem Ridge, with enough force to shake loose snow from rooftops and drive it across the prairie like white smoke. By midday, visibility had nearly vanished. Fence posts disappeared one by one beneath drifting snow. Then the temperature plunged. 0, -10, eventually -18 degrees. The blizzard remained for 4 straight days. Outside, cabins fought for survival. Stoves burned almost constantly. Firewood vanished at alarming rates. Men stepped into the storm to refill wood boxes and returned covered in frost. The church consumed fuel faster than anyone expected, its stove glowing from morning until night. Inside the Vale cabin, a different story unfolded. Not a comfortable one, not an easy one, but a controlled one. Each morning, Lenora recorded the numbers. Outside, temperatures dropped. Wind speeds increased. Snow continued to pile against the walls. Inside, conditions changed far less. The stove still required attention, but not every few hours. Heat lingered longer after each fire. The north wall remained dry. Mara spent part of the afternoons reading beside the table while snow hammered against the cabin. Tuck slept near the entrance curtain, occasionally lifting an ear whenever the wind struck the building particularly hard. Night became the true test. Across the settlement, many families woke repeatedly to feed their stoves. The Vale cabin remained quiet. No hurried footsteps crossed the floor before dawn. No frantic search for extra fuel interrupted sleep. Only the steady ticking of cooling iron and the distant howl of winter beyond the walls. Nature had finally begun its examination. And for 4 relentless days, the small spaces hidden behind those quilts continued doing exactly what Elin Svedberg had promised they would do. By the 3rd day of the blizzard, Reverend Amos Pike made a grim discovery. The church woodshed was nearly empty. Cords of wood, meant to last deep into January, had been devoured by the storm in a matter of days. Across Bluestem Ridge, the same quiet panic was spreading. The storm pulled heat through thin walls and loose windows faster than the stoves could replace it. Wood piles shrank drastically. Men risked the blinding snow just to drag frozen branches from the creek beds to keep their families from freezing. In her own drafty sitting room, Agnes Whitcomb wrapped another heavy shawl around her shoulders. Her previous mockery had faded into a troubled silence. From his window in town, Silas Reddick watched the whiteout conditions and waited. He waited for a desperate knock on his door. He waited for Lenora Vale to wade through the drifts and sign away her land for a fraction of its worth. No knock came. Whenever the snow broke long enough to see the ridge, a thin, steady ribbon of smoke still rose from the Vale cabin. It was not the thick, roaring black smoke of a desperate fire, but the calm breath of a house that was holding its own. The brutal winter that was supposed to break the young widow was breaking the rest of the settlement instead. For the first time since autumn, Silas Reddick's patient smile faltered. The storm finally moved east on the 5th morning. Bluestem Ridge emerged slowly from beneath the drifting snow. Chimneys smoked again. Paths were cleared. People stepped outside to inspect what winter had left behind. That afternoon, Agnes Whitcomb arrived at the Vale cabin. Officially, she came to check on Mara. At least that was the reason she gave. Lenora opened the door and stepped aside. Agnes crossed the threshold. Then she stopped. The warmth reached her before anything else. Not hot, not excessive, simply comfortable. After 4 days of brutal cold, the difference felt startling. Her eyes moved through the room. The stove still contained a modest fire, no roaring blaze, no desperate attempt to force heat into the cabin. A coffee pot rested nearby. Steam no longer rose from it, yet the metal remained warm enough to touch. Near the window, Mara sat on a small stool turning pages of a book. The child wore ordinary winter clothes. No extra blankets wrapped around her shoulders. No signs of shivering. The room felt calm. Outside, snowdrifts stood nearly waist-high in places. Inside, nothing suggested a family fighting for survival. Agnes slowly approached the north wall. Her hand brushed the edge of one quilt. Curiosity replaced skepticism. She pulled the fabric outward slightly. For the first time, she noticed the hidden space behind it. 3 inches, running the length of the wall. The same gap Lenora had measured again and again. Neither woman spoke for several moments. The cabin itself seemed to be answering questions that words never could. Agnes had expected hardship. What she found instead was evidence. Eventually, Agnes's attention settled on the notebook lying open on the table. Lenora noticed where she was looking. Without ceremony, she slid it across the surface. Agnes began turning pages. Entry after entry filled the paper. Dates, temperatures, fuel usage, weather conditions, measurements. The records covered weeks. Then she reached the pages from the blizzard. Outside temperature, -18 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside temperature, 41 degrees Fahrenheit. North wall gap, 3 inches. Fire added. After sunset, 1. The next entry looked similar, and the one after that. Agnes read quietly. No one interrupted her. As the numbers accumulated, a comparison formed in her mind whether she wanted it to or not. Her own house had consumed far more wood. Several nights required repeated trips to the stove. The church had nearly exhausted its winter reserve. Yet this cabin had crossed the same storm, with noticeably less fuel. The explanation sat all around her. The quilts, the airlock, the measurements, the discipline to build the system correctly. Agnes turned another page, then another. There were no dramatic claims written in the notebook. No declarations of success. Only observations. That made them harder to dismiss. At last she closed the cover and looked around the room again. The evidence existed in 2 forms. One stood before her in the shape of a warm cabin. The other rested beneath her hand in neat lines of ink. Together they left very little room for argument. Weeks earlier, the quilt-covered walls had seemed ridiculous. Now they appeared practical. And practicality carried a great deal of weight on the frontier. For the first time since Lenora began hanging quilts from her walls, Agnes found herself searching for questions instead of objections. Silas Reddick returned less than a week after the storm ended. The timing was no accident. Winter had delivered its hardest blow. If Lenora intended to surrender the claim, this was when it should have happened. He arrived carrying what he called a final offer. The number was higher than before. Not by much, but enough to reveal something he had not expected to reveal. Concern. Lenora listened politely. Then she declined once again. The answer came as easily as the first time. Silas remained where he was for a moment, studying the property. His eyes settled on the woodpile. There was still a respectable amount remaining, not enough to waste, more than there should have been. Next, he looked toward the cabin itself. The roof had survived the blizzard. The walls stood firm. No signs of desperation appeared anywhere on the property. Then Mara stepped out onto the porch, with Tuck at her side. The child looked healthy, fed, comfortable. Exactly the opposite of what a hard winter was supposed to produce in a household running short on fuel. For months, Silas had trusted the same strategy. Wait. Apply pressure. Let circumstances do the difficult work. Usually the prairie handled the rest. This time it had not, because the winter had never been the real enemy. Cold followed rules. Wind followed rules. Heat followed rules. Lenora had taken the time to understand them. Silas finally removed his gloves and folded the unsigned purchase papers. No argument followed. No second attempt. The negotiation had already been settled elsewhere. Not in town. Not on paper. But during 4 days of snow, wind, and bitter cold, a few minutes later, his wagon rolled away from the claim. The land remained exactly where it had always been. So did the cabin. And for the first time since Caleb's death, neither seemed in danger of being taken from her. Spring did not arrive all at once. First, the snow withdrew from the south sides of barns. Then wagon ruts softened into mud, and the creek began moving again beneath the broken ice. As soon as travel became easier, people started coming to the Vale cabin. They no longer came to stare. They brought rulers, cedar pegs, scraps of canvas, and questions about the narrow space behind the quilts. Lenora showed them where the heaviest fabric belonged, how to prevent it from touching the logs, and why the curtain behind the entrance mattered. Ellen Svedberg handled the explanations that required patience. She drew simple diagrams in the dirt, then taught each family to find drafts with a candle flame. The answer everyone wanted was always the same. 3 inches. Enough room to trap a layer of still air, but narrow enough to keep that air from circulating freely. Agnes Whitcomb never apologized for what she had said. By autumn, however, cedar pegs appeared along the north wall of her own house. A canvas curtain hung behind her front door. Before the first freeze, she measured the gap twice. That quiet imitation carried more weight than an apology ever could. The following winter provided another test. Elias Crow, an old freighter who had doubted the method at first, kept a record after hanging 2 quilts along the coldest wall of his cabin. His firewood use fell by nearly a third. Other families reported similar results. The method was no longer something that had worked once for one widow. It had become knowledge that could be repeated. Within a few years, quilted walls and small entrance airlocks appeared throughout Bluestem Ridge. Families still needed fires, but their stoves burned lower, and their wood piles lasted longer. Elin lived long enough to see the change. When she died one spring morning, she left behind no large property and no monument in the town square. What remained was more useful. People across the ridge understood where their heat escaped, and they knew how to slow that loss with materials already inside their homes. Lenora continued teaching what Ellen had taught her. As Mara grew older, she held the wooden spacer while younger children passed cedar pegs to their parents. Tuck eventually disappeared from his familiar place near the door, though Mara continued stepping around that empty spot for years afterward. The wedding quilt remained on the north wall until the Vale family built a larger frame house. Later, it was folded and stored with Lenora's notebook. Its stitching was never perfect. Several patches had faded, and one edge still carried a faint stain from the early condensation failure. That mark remained part of its story. The quilt had helped preserve a cabin, protect a land claim, and hold together the life Lenora and Mara were rebuilding. Frontier survival often depended on finding more fuel, more food, or more strength. That winter taught Bluestem Ridge a different lesson. Sometimes survival began by protecting what had already been earned. The fire produced the warmth. The quilt slowed its escape. But the real secret had always been the 3 inches of still air hidden between the fabric and the wall.